In 1818, a British expedition mapped the coastline of an island in the South Shetlands, just off the Antarctic Peninsula. They named it Rothschild Island. For 2 centuries, historians dismissed this as a minor geographic footnote, a wealthy banking family lending their name to a frozen rock in the most remote region on Earth. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if the Rothschild name on that island wasn't honorary? What if one of the most powerful financial dynasties in human history built something there that governments and central banks have spent the last 200 years keeping hidden? Because here's what nobody talks about. In 1818, the Rothschild family controlled more wealth than most European nations. They financed wars, toppled governments, and created the modern central banking system. And that same year, right when their power reached its absolute peak, an island in Antarctica suddenly bears their name. And to this day, Rothschild Island remains one of the most restricted territories in Antarctica. No research stations, no documented expeditions, no satellite imagery with any meaningful resolution, just a frozen landmass that supposedly holds nothing of value, yet remains completely off limits to everyone. The Rothschild banking dynasty didn't just finance the Industrial Revolution, they engineered the global financial architecture that still controls how money moves across every border on the planet. And if you follow the paper trail of gold shipments, naval records, and suppressed expedition logs from the early 1800s, a very different story starts to emerge about what they were really building in Antarctica. Nathan Mayer Rothschild arrived in London in 1798 with a vision his father's Frankfurt banking operation couldn't contain. He recognized that whoever controlled the flow of money between nations would control the nations themselves. By 1815, the Battle of Waterloo gave him that control. While the common story claims Nathan used insider information to profit from the stock market, the truth is darker. His courier network delivered news of Napoleon's defeat a full day before the British government knew. In that window, Nathan bought British government debt at pennies on the pound. When the victory was confirmed, he owned leverage over the British Empire itself. Within 3 years, the Rothschild family controlled bond markets across Austria, France, Naples, and Prussia. 5 brothers in 5 capitals, moving money faster than any government could track. They were the invisible engine behind European politics. And 1818 was the year everything changed. That was the year the Rothschilds transitioned from being wealthy bankers to becoming the architects of the modern financial system. Because that year, they didn't just lend money to governments, they started building the infrastructure that would let them control what governments could do with money in the first place. The same year, an island in Antarctica was named after them. Now, the official explanation for Rothschild Island is straightforward. British naval officer Edward Bransfield discovered and mapped the South Shetland Islands during an 1818 expedition. He named various features after patrons and notable figures of the time. Rothschild Island was supposedly named to honour the banking family, perhaps in hopes of future financial support for expeditions. That explanation works if you ignore 3 inconvenient facts. First, Edward Bransfield's expedition logs from 1818 contain a 6-week gap. From late November to early January, there are no recorded observations, no daily logs, nothing. For a Royal Navy officer whose entire job was documentation, that's not just unusual. It's impossible under Admiralty regulations. Second, the Rothschild family made an unusually large payment to the British Admiralty in early 1819. The payment was recorded in parliamentary finance records, but the stated purpose was listed as survey and mapping services. Standard payments to the Admiralty for civilian map commissions were a few £100. The Rothschild payment was £40,000. That's roughly $8 million in today's money for a map. Third, Rothschild Island is not actually one island. Modern surveys have confirmed it's 2 distinct landmasses separated by a narrow channel. But every map from 1818 until 1957 showed it as a single island, which means either British cartographers were incompetent for 140 years, or somebody intentionally obscured the true geography of the location. So what was really happening in Antarctica in 1818? To understand that, you have to look at what the Rothschild family was doing everywhere else. In 1817, Nathan Rothschild began coordinating with his brothers on a project they called the Consul System. The goal was simple: create a unified bond market across Europe where government debt could be bought and sold like a commodity. This was revolutionary. Before the Consul System, if you lent money to France, that loan stayed with France. You couldn't sell it, you couldn't trade it, you just waited and hoped France would pay you back. But Nathan realized that if debt could be traded, then debt itself could become a form of money, and whoever controlled the market where debt was traded would control the value of money itself. The Consul System required something that didn't exist yet: a neutral location where contracts could be stored, verified and settled without interference from any single government. A place where gold reserves could be physically held as backing for the paper debt instruments being traded across Europe. The Rothschilds needed a vault, not just any vault, a location so remote, so difficult to access, and so politically neutral that no government could seize it. No army could march on it, no revolution could burn it down. They needed Antarctica. Here's where the paper trail gets interesting. In 1816, 2 years before the Bransfield expedition, the Rothschild family quietly purchased 3 merchant vessels from a bankrupt Dutch shipping firm. These weren't ordinary cargo ships, they were ice-reinforced whaling vessels designed for polar navigation. The ships were registered under a shell company in Hamburg. The purchase was buried in routine commercial shipping records. But if you cross-reference the crew manifest with later Royal Navy expeditions, you find the same names appearing on multiple Antarctic voyages between 1818 and 1823. The Rothschilds had their own private fleet going to Antarctica, and they were sending them repeatedly. What were they transporting? Gold, staggering amounts of gold. In 1818, Europe was experiencing a gold shortage. The Napoleonic Wars had drained national treasuries. Spain's colonial gold supplies from South America were being cut off by independence movements. The price of gold was spiking across every market. But the Rothschild family wasn't buying gold during this shortage. They were moving it. Bills of lading from Hamburg and London show regular shipments of bullion leaving port, but the stated destinations were almost always survey and mineral assessment operations. Nobody ships gold to assess minerals. You ship gold when you're building reserves. And if you're building a reserve system for a new international bond market, you don't build it in London or Paris where governments can reach it. You build it where governments can't. You build it in the one place on Earth with no sovereignty, no competing claims, and no legal jurisdiction. You build it in Antarctica, specifically, on an island that carries your family name. The logistics make sense when you think about it. Rothschild Island sits in Ryder Bay, which is one of the few naturally deep harbours in the Antarctic Peninsula region. Ice-reinforced ships could anchor there even during winter months. The island itself has rocky outcrops and natural cave systems that could serve as storage. But storage alone doesn't explain the scale of what happened next. Between 1818 and 1825, something changed in global finance that historians still struggle to fully explain. It's called the Latin Monetary Union Crisis, though that name undersells what actually happened. In 1825, a series of bank failures swept through London. Dozens of banks collapsed in a matter of weeks. The British pound, which had been the most stable currency in Europe, suddenly lost 30% of its value. Panic spread to Paris, Vienna, and Naples. By December, the entire European banking system was on the edge of total collapse, and then, inexplicably, it stabilized. Within days, gold began flowing back into European markets, not from national treasuries, not from new mining discoveries, just gold appearing in sufficient quantities to stop the panic. The source? Bills of exchange drawn on Rothschild accounts. But the gold backing those bills wasn't in London or Frankfurt. The physical reserves that stopped the 1825 crisis came from somewhere else. Parliamentary inquiries in 1826 tried to trace where the Rothschilds had acquired the gold reserves that saved the European financial system. The family's answer was vague. They claimed it came from diversified holdings and long-term strategic positioning. But there's a document kept in the Rothschild archive in London that tells a different story. It's a shipping manifest from 1824. The ship was called the Endeavour III. The cargo was listed as mining equipment and supplies for Antarctic operations. The ship left London in August 1824. It returned in March 1825, just months before the banking crisis. The return cargo, no gold listed, just ballast materials and mineral samples. But the ship's draft, the measurement of how deep it sat in the water, was recorded by harbour officials in both London and Cape Town. When the Endeavour 3 left London, it drew 12 feet. When it returned, it drew 18 feet. That's the displacement consistent with a ship carrying an additional 200 tons of cargo. 200 tons of gold is roughly $400 million worth at 1825 prices. At today's prices, that's about $7 billion. You don't mine $7 billion worth of gold from equipment and supplies. You mine it from an existing operation, an operation that was already up and running, an operation that had been built years earlier, an operation in Antarctica. Now, before we go further, let's address the obvious question. If the Rothschilds built a gold vault in Antarctica in 1818, why not just keep it in Switzerland, where banking secrecy was already established? The answer is jurisdiction. Nathan Rothschild understood that visible wealth creates political risk. European governments were already nervous about Rothschild power, whispering about nationalizing banks and seizing assets. But wealth that exists in account ledgers with no clear physical location, that's untouchable. If you're a government, you can seize a bank building in Paris, but you can't seize what sits in Antarctica, a location that might as well have been the moon in 1818. By building reserves there, the Rothschilds created money that existed outside any jurisdiction. They could issue bonds backed by gold that physically sat where no government controlled. And because no one could verify the gold was actually there, the Rothschilds controlled the narrative about how much backing their instruments had. This is the foundation of modern central banking. Money backed not by gold you can see, but by the promise of gold that exists somewhere. The Rothschilds didn't just pioneer this system, they built the literal infrastructure for it. In Antarctica, on an island that still bears their name. And then, in 1830, something happened that changed everything. The July Revolution swept through France. King Charles X was overthrown. The new government, led by Louis Philippe, immediately moved to audit all foreign financial holdings and contracts tied to the previous regime. The Rothschild family had extensive contracts with Charles X. The new government wanted to know where the collateral for those contracts was physically located. They demanded access to Rothschild vaults, ledgers, everything. James Rothschild, the brother operating in Paris, gave them access to the Paris vaults. He showed them the Frankfurt reserves. He opened the books in London. And every time French auditors found that the gold backing French government bonds was recorded as held in remote strategic reserves, James would smile and say the physical gold was being held in a location protected by British naval authority under international maritime law. The French government demanded specifics. James gave them coordinates in Antarctica, Rothschild Island. And what was France going to do? Send an expedition to Antarctica to verify. In 1830, that would take 2 years and cost a fortune. By the time they got there and back, the political situation would have changed completely. The French government backed down. They accepted the Rothschild accounting, because challenging it meant challenging the entire system of international finance that every European government now depended on. That moment in 1830 was when the Rothschilds stopped being bankers and became the system itself. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. In 1838, the United States launched the Wilkes expedition, the largest Antarctic exploration effort undertaken by any nation to that point. 6 ships, 400 men, 4 years of planned exploration and mapping. The official purpose was scientific research and mapping of the Antarctic coast. But the expedition's private orders, which weren't declassified until 1934, included specific instructions to investigate foreign installations or claims of territorial development in Antarctic regions. The Wilkes expedition did extensive surveying of the Antarctic Peninsula and the South Shetland Islands. But there's a strange gap in their reports. Rothschild Island is mentioned once in the official log. The entry reads, "Island surveyed from distance. No landing attempted due to ice conditions." But another document, a personal journal kept by one of the expedition's junior officers, tells a different story. That journal entry from February 1839 describes seeing structures on Rothschild Island, stone buildings or excavations visible from the ship even at a distance. The officer noted it seemed unusual for a supposedly uninhabited location. That journal entry was purchased by a private collector in 1972. It's never been displayed publicly. When the Wilkes expedition returned to the United States in 1842, Congress held hearings about the expedition's findings. During those hearings, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes was asked directly whether any evidence of foreign occupation or development had been found in Antarctica. Wilkes answered, "Nothing of significance." When pressed by a congressman from New York about rumors of structures or installations, Wilkes replied, "The Antarctic is a land of ice and illusion. The eye sees many things that are not there." 3 months after that testimony, the Rothschild family extended a substantial line of credit to the United States Treasury to help finance infrastructure projects. That credit was offered at unusually favorable terms. The congressman from New York, who had been asking questions about Antarctica, withdrew his inquiry. The pattern repeats across the 19th century. Any time a government or expedition showed interest in Rothschild Island specifically, financial pressure or political complications would emerge, funding would dry up, permits would be delayed, ships would be reassigned, and when expeditions did reach the area, their findings about Rothschild Island were always minimal. Ice prevented landing. Weather closed in. Equipment failed. Every single time. By the early 1900s, Rothschild Island had developed a reputation among Antarctic explorers as cursed or unlucky. Expeditions avoided it, not because of official restrictions, but because trying to study the island seemed to invite disaster. In 1933, something changed. The British government, under pressure from economic collapse during the Great Depression, began considering nationalizing gold reserves held by private banking families. 6 weeks later, the Antarctic Treaty Preliminary Framework was quietly drafted. A predecessor to the famous 1959 treaty, negotiated in secret among Britain, France, and the United States. That 1933 agreement established specific territorial claims in Antarctica, but also designated certain areas as protected scientific reserves that would be off-limits to all parties. Rothschild Island was listed as a protected reserve. By the time the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, Rothschild Island had been locked down through overlapping protections. Under the treaty, no military activity is permitted, no resource extraction, no permanent structures. But Rothschild Island carried an additional designation, Special Protected Area, meaning even scientific research required approval from multiple signatory nations. To this day, no research station exists on or near Rothschild Island. Satellite imagery exists, but the highest resolution publicly available images are deliberately degraded. When you request satellite data through normal scientific FANG channels, you receive images with 50-meter resolution at best. Meanwhile, commercial satellites provide half-meter resolution for almost everywhere else on Earth. Who's blocking higher resolution images of Rothschild Island? The Antarctic Treaty nations cite protection of pristine environment and minimizing human impact. But the same treaty allows detailed imaging of emperor penguin breeding colonies, research stations, and mineral surveys everywhere else in Antarctica. Only Rothschild Island remains deliberately obscured. There's a reason for that, because something is still there. In 2004, a geophysical survey team from Cambridge University was conducting ice-penetrating radar studies of the Antarctic Peninsula. They were mapping bedrock formations and glacial movement, standard scientific work. Their radar passed over Rothschild Island, and they found something that shouldn't exist. Underground voids, extensive chamber systems carved into the bedrock beneath the ice. The radar signature indicated artificial construction, not natural caves, straight walls, geometric patterns, sections that showed metallic returns consistent with reinforced structures. The Cambridge team submitted their findings to the British Antarctic Survey for peer review. The data was classified as requiring further verification, and the team was told that continued study of that specific site would not be approved due to environmental protection protocols. One of the researchers on that team, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, gave an interview to a small scientific Journal in 2007. She said the radar data from Rothschild Island showed construction consistent with early 19th century excavation techniques. She said whatever was under that ice had been built a long time ago, and it was extensive. Dr. Mitchell was denied funding for future Antarctic research. She left academia in 2009 and now works in private sector environmental consulting. Her interview has been scrubbed from most online archives, but the implications are staggering. If there are underground structures on Rothschild Island built in the early 1800s, then every assumption about Antarctic construction has to be reconsidered. Building there in 1818 would have been brutal. No power tools, no heavy machinery, just manual labour in sub-zero temperatures. But it's not impossible. Stone can be cut and moved. Underground chambers can be excavated if you have enough workers and enough time, and the Rothschild family in 1818 had access to both. The more important question isn't whether they could have built it, it's what they built it for. Gold storage is one answer, but gold doesn't require elaborate underground chambers. You can store gold in reinforced shipping containers unless you're storing something more valuable than gold. Documents. The Rothschild family accumulated something more valuable than gold over the centuries. Information, contracts, records of who owed what to whom. The original agreements that formed the foundation of the modern financial system. If those documents were destroyed in a revolution or seized by a government, the entire architecture of international debt could collapse. Bondholders could claim they never borrowed. Lenders could forge records. Chaos. But if the original documents exist somewhere and no one can reach them, then the Rothschild family holds the ultimate leverage. They hold the proof of what's real. Think about it. Every major financial crisis, every debt renegotiation, every international dispute about who owes what comes back to one question. What do the original contracts say? And who holds the originals? Not copies, not certified duplicates. The actual signed documents that establish the first international bonds, the first central bank agreements, the first debt instruments that modern finance is built on. If you're the Rothschild family, you don't keep those in a bank vault in London where a fire or a revolution could destroy them. You keep them in the most secure, most remote, most unreachable location on Earth. You keep them in Antarctica. This explains something that has puzzled financial historians for decades. How did the Rothschild family maintain influence even as their visible wealth declined in the 20th century? In 1900, the Rothschilds were the richest family in the world by a massive margin. By 1950, they had been eclipsed by oil barons, industrialists, tech founders. Their banks were no longer dominant. Their political influence seemed to fade. But behind the scenes, international finance still bent around Rothschild positions. Central banks still consulted them. Debt restructuring still went through Rothschild intermediaries. Why? Because they hold the receipts. The original documentation that proves the chain of ownership for trillions in global debt, and those receipts are in Antarctica, on Rothschild Island. Which brings us to the final question. Why can't you visit Rothschild Island? The Antarctic Treaty says you can visit Antarctica. Tourism is allowed. Scientific research is encouraged. Private expeditions are permitted with proper permits and environmental reviews. But Rothschild Island specifically, every permit application gets denied. Environmental concerns, protected wildlife habitat, unstable ice conditions, pick your excuse. In 2016, a private expedition funded by a cryptocurrency billionaire attempted to land on Rothschild Island. They had obtained permits for Antarctic tourism. They hired an ice-rated yacht. They planned to document the visit and release high-resolution imagery online. The yacht was intercepted 70 miles from Rothschild Island by a Chilean naval vessel. The Chilean Navy claimed the yacht had drifted into restricted waters. The expedition was turned back. The cryptocurrency billionaire posted about the incident online. He said Chilean officials told him the area was closed for ongoing research operations. But when he asked what research, who was conducting it, and when the area would reopen, he received no answer. 2 weeks later, his cryptocurrency exchange was hit with regulatory investigations in 3 countries simultaneously. The investigations found no wrongdoing, but the legal costs and negative publicity destroyed his public image. He never attempted another Antarctic expedition. That's the pattern. Anyone who pushes too hard to access Rothschild Island faces consequences. Not direct threats, not obvious retaliation, just friction. just enough obstacles to make the effort too costly to continue. Because what's on Rothschild Island isn't just historical, it's current, it's operational. The underground chambers that Cambridge's radar detected in 2004, those weren't abandoned ruins. The radar returns showed electromagnetic signatures consistent with active power systems. Something down there is running. Something is being maintained. You don't maintain an abandoned vault. You don't power empty chambers. Whatever the Rothschilds built in Antarctica in 1818 is still serving its purpose. The financial architecture they created, the system of international debt and central banking that controls the flow of money across every border, still relies on the foundation they laid in Antarctica 2 centuries ago. And that foundation cannot be revealed, because if the world saw the original documents, the original contracts, the actual agreements that created the debt system modern civilization runs on, questions would be asked. Questions about legitimacy, about whether debts accrued over centuries are still valid, about who actually owns what, about whether the entire global financial system is built on agreements that were never meant to be public. The Rothschild family doesn't need to be the richest anymore. They just need to be the keepers of the records, the holders of the proof, the guardians of the original agreements that give legitimacy to trillions in debt obligations. And they keep those records where no government can touch them, where no revolution can burn them, where no freedom of information request can reach them. They keep them on Rothschild Island, in Antarctica, in chambers carved into bedrock beneath the ice, protected by international treaty, monitored by multiple nations who all have a vested interest in making sure no one ever gets too close. Because if Rothschild Island were truly just an empty rock, there would be no reason to protect it so carefully. No reason to deny every permit, no reason to degrade satellite imagery, no reason to intercept private expeditions 70 miles away. The fact that you cannot visit Rothschild Island is the proof that something worth protecting is there. And the people protecting it aren't just the Rothschild family anymore. They're every central bank, every finance ministry, every government that depends on the current system of international debt to function. They're protecting the foundation, the proof, the original agreements. They're protecting the system itself, which means you'll never be allowed to see what's really there, because letting you see would mean acknowledging it exists. And acknowledging it exists would mean answering questions about legitimacy that the global financial system cannot afford to answer. So Rothschild Island remains restricted, monitored but never visited, named but never explained. A footnote in Antarctic geography that just happens to carry the name of the family that built the modern financial world. And 200 years later, that island still serves the purpose it was built for, keeping secrets that are too valuable to ever be revealed. The ice will melt eventually. Climate change is already reshaping Antarctica. Glaciers are retreating, coastlines are changing. But by the time the ice on Rothschild Island fully melts, whatever was built there will have been removed. The chambers will be collapsed, the documents will be relocated, the evidence will be erased, because the people who built that system 2 centuries ago understood something fundamental about power. It's not about how much wealth you have, it's about controlling what others believe about wealth, about debt, about who owes what to whom, and that control requires one thing above all else: secrecy, the kind of secrecy you can only maintain in the most remote location on Earth. The Rothschilds built that secrecy in 1818, and it's still standing today, under the ice, on an island you'll never be allowed to visit, holding secrets the world will never be allowed to see.